Welcome to our YouTube channel, The Alien Tales, and please ensure that you have subscribed.
She acts out our love story for the Alien Council. I watch my life become their entertainment. Her people learn through performance. She's recreating our relationship as evidence. I'm watching myself fall in love from the audience. The amphitheater gleamed with bioluminescent walls that pulsed in rhythm with the assembled crowd's collective heartbeat. I sat in the designated witness seat, a crystalline throne that made me feel like a specimen under observation. The Zypherian Council of 12 floated in their gossamer pods, their translucent bodies shimmering with anticipation. "The human appears distressed," observed Counselor Vithara, her voice rippling through my universal translator like wind chimes in a hurricane. Distressed didn't begin to cover it. My girlfriend Rhiannon was about to perform our entire relationship for beings who literally fed on emotional resonance. For her people, this wasn't entertainment, it was education, communication, survival. For me, it was 3 years of private moments about to become public consumption. "She's just nervous?" I lied, wiping sweaty palms on my ceremonial viewing robes. Rhiannon had spent weeks preparing this emotional archive performance, as she called it. Her copper-tinted skin had taken on the telltale silver shimmer that meant she was accessing her species' performative state. The theater dimmed. Rhiannon stepped into the center circle, her form beginning to blur and shift. This was how Zypherians learned, through complete sensory recreation. They didn't just watch stories, they experienced them. "Beginning archive, human Zypherian bonding sequence," she announced, her voice now carrying harmonic undertones that made my teeth ache. "Subject, Thomas Caldwell. Observer, present and consenting." I wasn't sure about the consenting part anymore. She began to transform, and I watched in horror as she became me. Gangly, awkward 28-year-old me from that first day at the interspecies research station, complete with my ridiculous nervous laugh and the coffee stain on my lab coat. The council leaned forward hungrily. Rhiannon as me stumbled through the airlock with exaggerated clumsiness that was both accurate and mortifying. She'd nailed my tendency to trip over my own feet when nervous, complete with the flailing arms and muttered curses that I thought nobody noticed. "Oh, fantastic," she mimicked in my voice. "Way to make a first impression on the alien delegation, Tom. Just spectacular." A second figure materialized, Rhiannon playing herself, but from 3 years ago. Younger, more formal, with that rigid posture she'd adopted when trying to appear professionally human. The contrast was striking. She'd been so worried about cultural contamination back then. "Greetings, Dr. Caldwell," other Rhiannon said with mechanical precision. "I am Research Coordinator Rhiannon of the Zypherian Science Collective. Please maintain appropriate interpersonal distance as per Protocol 47B. The Council's delighted murmurs filled the theater. Apparently, watching alien-human first contact was comedy gold to them. Rhiannon extended a hand for a handshake, clearly having studied human customs but not quite understanding the execution. She grabbed my wrist with both hands and shook my entire arm like she was trying to dislodge something. "Nice to, meet you too?" Rhiannon replied, eyes wide with confusion and something that might have been early-stage attraction. I cringed in my seat. Had I really been that obvious? The way she portrayed me, I was practically drooling. "The human's biochemical markers indicate intense romantic interest," Counselor Nethes observed clinically. "Fascinating. Such immediate response to an unfamiliar species." Rhiannon caught my eye from the performance circle and winked, a gesture that somehow transcended her shape-shifted form. The real question was, what embarrassing detail would she reveal next? The scene shifted to the station's cafeteria, and I knew exactly what was coming. My stomach dropped like a stone as the memory materialized around us in vivid, humiliating detail. "No, no, no," I whispered, but the performance continued. Rhiannon sat at a table, attempting to eat a sandwich with what could only be described as archaeological precision. She was dissecting it layer by layer, taking notes on each component like it was a xenobiological specimen. Bread, grain-based carbohydrate matrix. Turkey, deceased avian protein. Lettuce, chlorophyll-containing plant matter arranged for aesthetic purposes. Real Rhiannon approached the table, still in her rigid, professional demeanor. "Dr. Caldwell?" I hope I'm not interrupting your feeding ritual. Feeding ritual? Rhiannon squeaked, and I could feel my face burning in the present moment. It's just lunch. Would you like to, partake in my feeding ritual? I mean, eat with me? Normally, like a normal person, the council was practically vibrating with amusement. I do not require sustenance at this temporal junction, Professional Rhiannon replied, then hesitated. However, I am curious about the nutritional optimization of your species' consumption patterns. What followed was the most awkward lunch invitation in the history of interspecies relations. Rhiannon, in her enthusiasm to share human culture, accidentally knocked over her water glass, soaking the sandwich and sending a pickle flying across the cafeteria to land with a wet splat on the wall. Advanced tool usage, Rhiannon deadpanned in her own voice, while maintaining perfect character as bewildered past me. I'm impressed by your projectile accuracy, Professional Rhiannon replied without missing a beat, and I caught the first hint of the dry humor that would later make me fall completely in love with her. The real Rhiannon's eyes sparkled with mischief as she prepared the next scene. The performance space transformed into our old research lab, complete with the humming equipment and the smell of ozone that I'd grown to associate with the happiest period of my life. Well, before this moment, research log, day 15. Rhiannon announced to an imaginary recorder. Zypherian cognitive patterns continue to baffle and, intrigue the research team. Past Rhiannon materialized beside her, now noticeably more relaxed than in previous scenes. Her posture had softened, and she'd started incorporating small human gestures. A clear sign she was becoming more comfortable around me. Tom, she said, using my first name for the first time in the recreation. I believe your species has a saying about curiosity and felines? Curiosity killed the cat, Rhiannon replied absently, focused on calibrating a particularly delicate piece of scanning equipment. Yes, well, I'm about to test that hypothesis. What followed was a perfect recreation of the day Rhiannon decided to experience human technology by attempting to operate every piece of equipment in the lab simultaneously. The results had been spectacular. Sparks flew as past Rhiannon activated 3 incompatible scanning arrays at once. Warning lights bathed the recreated lab in strobing red. Rhiannon dove to shut down the power grid while past Rhiannon stood in the center of the chaos with an expression of delighted scientific curiosity. Fascinating. The electromagnetic interference is creating a localized temporal distortion field. That's not fascinating, that's terrifying, Rhiannon shouted over the alarm klaxons. We're about to create a black hole in the middle of the station, the council gasped in unison. Apparently, accidental black hole creation was universally alarming. Past Rhiannon's expression shifted to horror as she realized the implications. In that moment, watching her face change, Rhiannon stopped panicking about the equipment and started worrying about her instead. The real Rhiannon paused the scene, leaving the audience suspended in that moment of realization when attraction became something deeper. The lab emergency dissolved into the station's observation deck, where past Rhiannon and Rhiannon stood side by side, looking out at the swirling nebula beyond. This was dangerous territory. I could feel my heart rate climbing just from the memory. I owe you an apology, past Rhiannon said softly. My people, we experience the universe differently. Sometimes I forget that your equipment wasn't designed for our level of sensory interaction. It's okay, Rhiannon replied, standing closer than strictly professional. Actually, it was kind of amazing. I've never seen someone so excited about nearly destroying a space station. Past Rhiannon laughed. The first real, unguarded laugh she'd allowed herself around me. Your species has such interesting ways of expressing affection. Fear-based bonding rituals. Is that what that was? The tension in the performance space was palpable. The council had gone completely silent, their bioluminescent forms pulsing with anticipation. Even they could sense what was coming. Past Rhiannon turned to face Rhiannon, and I watched my younger self's face transform with the realization that this brilliant, dangerous, completely alien woman was looking at me like I mattered. Tom, she whispered, reaching up to touch his face with trembling fingers. Is this appropriate? I don't know, Rhiannon breathed, leaning closer. But I don't care. They moved toward each other with agonizing slowness. The entire theater held its breath. I found myself leaning forward in my crystalline seat, even though I knew exactly what happened next. Their lips were inches apart when the station's emergency broadcast system crackled to life. All personnel to emergency stations. Code yellow. Repeat. Code yellow. Rhiannon jerked back like she'd been electrocuted. Rhiannon's face cycled through disappointment, confusion, and professional concern in rapid succession. Duty calls, Rhiannon said with a shaky smile, and the moment was gone. The real Rhiannon caught my eye and mouthed, "Sorry?" But her expression suggested she wasn't sorry at all. The scene shifted to the station's diplomatic quarters, where Rhiannon was in conversation with another Zypherian. A tall, elegant figure I recognized with a sinking heart as Ambassador Kellen. The council's attention sharpened. This was clearly a crucial moment in their understanding of human Zypherian dynamics. "Rhiannon," the ambassador said with the kind of smooth confidence that had always made me feel like an awkward teenager. "The collective has concerns about your proximity to the human researcher." Rhiannon's posture stiffened. "My work with Dr. Caldwell is producing unprecedented insights into human behavioral patterns. Your work, yes, but the emotional resonance patterns you're broadcasting suggest something beyond professional interest." Rhiannon chose that moment to walk past the diplomatic quarters, clearly trying to appear casual while obviously eavesdropping. The performance captured my pathetic attempt at stealth perfectly. I'd been about as subtle as a supernova. "Perhaps it would be beneficial if I completed this research assignment," Ambassador Kellen continued, and I watched Rhiannon's face cycle through emotions I hadn't been able to interpret at the time. "That won't be necessary," Rhiannon replied coolly. "I am perfectly capable of maintaining professional boundaries." Rhiannon's face fell at those words, and he hurried away before hearing the rest of the conversation. The real Rhiannon made sure the audience could see what I'd missed. The way Rhiannon's hands clenched into fists, the way her bioluminescent patterns flickered with distress. "Professional boundaries," Ambassador Kellen repeated skeptically. "Rhiannon, you're glowing." Rhiannon looked down at her hands, which were indeed shimmering with the telltale signs of emotional distress. "That's a completely normal physiological response to diplomatic discussions." The ambassador's expression suggested he wasn't buying it, and neither was the council, who were now murmuring excitedly about interspecies emotional contamination. The scene ended with Rhiannon alone, touching her lips where she'd almost kissed me. The performance space became the research lab again, but the atmosphere was completely different. Rhiannon and Rhiannon worked at opposite ends of the room, the air between them thick with unspoken tension and hurt feelings. "Research log, day 37, Rhiannon announced stiffly. "Zypherian subject continues to maintain optimal professional distance. Emotional contamination has been successfully prevented." The bitterness in those last words made me wince. I'd been so hurt by what I'd overheard that I'd thrown myself into treating our relationship like a clinical experiment. Rhiannon looked up from her work, and I could see the moment she decided she'd had enough. "Tom," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the lab equipment hum sympathetically. "We need to discuss the parameters of our working relationship." "Our working relationship is fine," Rhiannon replied without looking up from his data pad. "Professional, distant, just how your people prefer it." "My people?" Rhiannon's bioluminescent patterns flared dangerously. "What exactly do you mean by that?" The council leaned forward eagerly. Apparently, interspecies relationship drama was peak entertainment. "I mean," Rhiannon said, finally meeting her gaze, "that I clearly misunderstood the nature of our collaboration. I thought we were becoming friends. Maybe even what? Nothing. Forget it. Let's just focus on the research." Rhiannon crossed the lab in 3 swift steps, her movements carrying the fluid grace that had always made my heart skip beats. "Tom Caldwell," she said with dangerous quiet, "if you think I spent the last month learning to appreciate terrible human coffee and your species' bizarre sense of humor just for research purposes, then you're even more obtuse than Ambassador Kellen suggested." Rhiannon's head snapped up. "Wait, what?" I said. Rhiannon continued, her voice rising, "that you're an idiot if you think I don't." The lab door chimed, interrupting what promised to be either a confession or an explosion. Ambassador Kellen entered the recreated lab with perfect timing, as if summoned by the dramatic tension. The real Rhiannon's portrayal of him was masterful. She captured his insufferable smugness, while somehow making it clear that he genuinely believed he was acting in everyone's best interests. "Rhiannon," he said, surveying the emotionally charged scene. "Perhaps we should discuss your reassignment to the Alpha Centauri research station." "My what?" Both past Rhiannon and Rhiannon exclaimed simultaneously. The council's excitement was palpable. This was clearly the climax they'd been waiting for. "The collective has determined that your emotional resonance patterns have become compromised," Ambassador Kellen explained delicately. "Extended exposure to human psychological frameworks has created an unprecedented level of cross-species empathy. While scientifically fascinating, it poses risks to your objectivity." Past Rhiannon's bioluminescent patterns exploded into brilliant, angry colors. "My objectivity is perfectly intact." "Rhiannon," Ambassador Kellen said gently, "you're currently displaying a chromatic pattern that roughly translates to, 'I will fight anyone who tries to separate me from my mate.'" The silence that followed was deafening. Rhiannon stared at past Rhiannon with the expression of someone whose world had just been completely rearranged. "Mate," he whispered. Past Rhiannon's colors shifted to what I now knew was the Zypherian equivalent of a blush. "It's a rough translation." "How rough?" "Well," she said, her voice smaller now, "it could also mean beloved companion or person whose absence would cause existential despair." Rhiannon took a step toward her. "And which translation are we going with?" Past Rhiannon met his gaze steadily. "The one that means I'm not going to Alpha Centauri." Ambassador Kellen cleared his throat. "Rhiannon, the collective has already—" "The collective," Past Rhiannon interrupted with magnificent fury, "can kiss my bioluminescent posterior." The theater erupted in shocked gasps from the council. Apparently, that phrase translated perfectly across species lines. The scene dissolved and reformed as the station's command center, where Captain Morrison, played with uncanny accuracy by Rhiannon, sat behind his desk looking like he'd rather be anywhere else in the galaxy. Past Rhiannon and Rhiannon stood before him, hands clasped in a show of unity that made my heart ache with the memory. "So let me get this straight," Captain Morrison said, rubbing his temples. "You want me to file a formal diplomatic protest to prevent the Zypherian collective from reassigning their researcher because you two have, what did you call it? Formed an unprecedented interspecies emotional bond," Rhiannon said with the kind of earnest determination that had gotten me into trouble my entire life. "We're in love," Past Rhiannon added more simply, "though I believe the technical term Tom species uses is completely and utterly smitten beyond all reason." Captain Morrison's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. "That's not a technical term." "It should be," Rhiannon said firmly. "It's remarkably accurate." The council was vibrating with excitement now. Several of them were taking notes, their forms pulsing with the rapid data absorption patterns I'd learned to recognize during my time with Rhiannon. "The regulations are clear," Captain Morrison continued. "I can't interfere with Zypherian internal personnel decisions. Unless," he paused, looking thoughtful, "unless there's a compelling research justification." Past Rhiannon and Rhiannon exchanged glances. "What kind of research justification?" they asked in unison. Captain Morrison smiled for the first time in the scene. "The kind that involves documenting the first successful long-term human-Zypherian romantic relationship for the benefit of future diplomatic relations." "You want us to be test subjects for love?" Rhiannon asked incredulously. "Tom," Past Rhiannon said softly, "I've been a test subject for love since the day I met you." The real Rhiannon paused the performance there, leaving me and the council hanging on the edge of that perfect moment. The final scene materialized around us. The same observation deck where we'd almost kissed months earlier, but now the tension was different. Past Rhiannon and Rhiannon stood together, officially approved for their research project, watching the nebula swirl beyond the viewport. "So," Rhiannon said, finally brave enough to reach for her hand, "how do we scientifically document being in love?" Past Rhiannon interlaced their fingers, her bioluminescent patterns settling into the warm, steady glow I'd come to associate with contentment. "I believe we start with this." She turned to face him, and this time there was no emergency alert to interrupt them. Their kiss was soft, tentative, and absolutely perfect. The council sighed collectively, their forms brightening with vicarious joy. As the kiss ended, Rhiannon rested her forehead against Rhiannon's. Tom, yeah, when I perform this story for my people, I want to make sure I get this part exactly right. Rhiannon smiled. Which part? The part where I tell them that humans are terrible at expressing emotions, completely irrational in their decision-making processes, and absolutely impossible to live without once you've learned to love them. The performance circle began to fade, and the real Rhiannon stepped forward, her natural form returning as she took a bow. The council erupted in appreciative harmonics that filled the theater with beautiful, alien music. Archive complete, she announced formally, but her eyes were on me. Human Zypherian bonding sequence successfully documented and preserved. Counselor Vithara floated forward. A remarkable educational experience. We understand now why you chose to remain with this human. I stood from my crystalline throne, legs shaky from 3 hours of emotional reliving. So, I called out to Rhiannon. How did I do as a test subject? She crossed to me with that fluid grace that still made my heart skip, wrapped her arms around my neck, and kissed me in front of the entire council. You're perfect, she whispered against my lips. Absolutely terrible at being subtle, but perfect. As we left the theater together, I realized that having our love story performed for an audience of aliens was probably the most romantic thing that had ever happened to me. Which, knowing Rhiannon, was probably exactly what she'd intended all along.